Hello, this is James Hudnall and another episode of Creative Secrets. This is number 29, and this one is about a favorite subject of mine, setups and payoffs. Setups and payoffs is one of the great tools of storytelling that you should know, and you should know how to do correctly because a lot of people do it wrong. So let me show you how it's done. The great Russian playwright Anton Chekhov wrote that if a shotgun hangs on the wall in the first act, it must be used by the climax. This is a succinct definition of a setup and a payoff. You visually show something, and then later you explain what it is in a surprising way. And that is how a setup and payoff works. You do not want to do a payoff without a setup. Result of that will be muted, and or your audience may be upset because you shouldn't have characters pull things out of the blue when it's never been set up before. Then the audience will feel like they're just able to do something on a whim of the writer and not organically as part of the story process. You never want to reveal the writer's hand when you're writing. You never want them to know that you, the writer, threw that in there. That's probably one of the big mistakes any writer can do. Even big-name writers do it, but it doesn't make them good. If they do that, that's lazy. And to be frank, setups are fun. Setting up something that you plan to do later is actually very cool, and it can make it more interesting for the reader as well, because they'll get a dawning realization that you showed them something in plain sight, and they didn't pick up on it until it mattered. That's what makes it exciting. When you read a story and suddenly you realize that something that was said earlier in the story is relevant later on, it makes you, the writer, look a lot cooler than if you just made it obvious that a writer came up with this idea in the middle of the story because they didn't know what to do next. That's how it looks like without the setup. So you want to avoid that. Most people don't like being lied to or manipulated, which is what happens when you don't do a setup. You make it look like you just came up with something because the plot needed it at that time. That is, again, something to be avoided. You don't want to lose the audience by all means. So the purpose of a setup is to tell the audience what this item, talent, power, whatever, exists in this story world. This way, when it's used later in the story, it doesn't seem random. We know that it can happen. As we discussed in an earlier chapter, the audience respects reality to be reasonably consistent and emulated in your story, so that things need to behave according to some rules. Objects don't appear out of the blue in reality, and they shouldn't be in your story. When you do a payoff, you want your setup to be done in such a way that it's not going to spoil the surprise. So you have to be subtle about it. You have to be clever. You can't just say, hey, look, something's going to happen because of this. You don't want to do that. You want to give maybe a sense of that, but not necessarily. Sometimes you just want something that's constantly in the scene until its result is needed. And that is something that, like the shotgun on the fireplace mantle, it could be there in the first act, it'd be there constantly, and it's just sitting there like a table weight or like a lamp or something, and then it gets used as a murder weapon later. So that's what it's for, is so that you know that it's there and it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of a place that you saw before, which makes it like something familiar and therefore more like something in a reality or simulated reality, which is what a story is. Nothing in the story should go to waste, so you shouldn't do a setup without a payoff, and you shouldn't have something in there that's a fake setup that never goes anywhere unless you're trying to trick the audience into misleading them where the story is going or what's going to happen, and you surprise them with a payoff that goes in a different direction than you would think. But that payoff should be related to that setup. There should be some kind of continuity between the two. By all means, make your setups not obvious. You don't want to tip the audience off. You just want them to be a clue, basically. Or a form of foreshadowing, which I'll get into in another. The main object of a setup is to show people that something is in the video whether it be an object of some kind or a situation, so that it will pay off later. If you've never seen one, or even if you have, I recommend watching Alfred Hitchcock movies because he's a master of the setup and the payoff, and he's really good at using them. So you might want to study a few to get a sense of how he does it. The basic payoff is either a twist in the story, a surprise. The other kind is a revelation. A revelation is a situation where you have something that creates an epiphany. That is where something happens that sets off a light bulb in the audience's mind, and they suddenly realize, oh, that's why that's going on. Or, wow, now I see the whole movie in a different perspective. I'm sure you've had those situations where you've read a book or a movie, seen a movie, and you're just like, wow, that blows my mind. Now I see everything from a totally different angle. That, an epiphany, is what it's called, is a great thing to do if you can do it. And the audience will appreciate you when you can pull it off, because you've opened their mind. You've gotten them to see differently than their normal perceptions of things. And that sort of gives them an idea. It also makes them feel more intelligent if you seed the story with a lot of clues and then they pay off later. And then you can go, oh yeah, of course. I'm sure you've seen those movies where they have a scene towards the end where they show a lot of flashbacks to a lot of different little things that add up to a revelation that is thrown at you. And if they do it well, that's one thing, but I've seen it done poorly in other cases where it's just like heavy-handed and it's like an obvious payoff. So you have to execute this with cleverness and style, and that's something you develop with experience. So if you can't do it off instantly in your beginning, that's okay. You only get better by trying things over and over until you get it right. Just like in cooking, your first steak or whatever that you make may not come out as great as it is in a restaurant, but once you have the skill down, then you can do it in your sleep. And it's the same thing with writing. One thing to remember is if you can do things visually, it always is better, simply because people can absorb things visually more so than they can be with spoken words. So telling people something may not penetrate their mind, or they may not remember it, but if you do it visually, it sort of seeps in more effectively. So they can absorb a lot of information that way, and this is why visual setups and payoffs are always work better than verbal ones. People have a tendency to rewrite conversations in their head. Words are easily forgotten, but a strong visual sticks. You also hit them with images now and then that doesn't quite fit into the overall picture. Our audience is either drawn to those images for no apparent reason, or they stick out like a sore thumb in the midst of the scene. These are cues that are like road signs in the subconscious. They tell us to watch for falling rocks, for example. So that's how you can do a setup in a subtle way. When I say images, this applies to prose as well. You describe what is happening, what the character sees. You can do it in a way that is memorable. Describing something boring won't stick in people's minds. If you can describe something in a very eloquent way, it may stick in their mind a lot more effectively as a writer. Another type of setup is setting up characters. This works in a similar way to the standard setup, but there are differences. Characters who play an important role later in the story need to be set up early on, but they need to have a logical place in the relation of things. In some stories, a seemingly harmless character will turn out to be the true villain, while earlier the audience was tricked into thinking that another person is the guy. Supporting characters need to be set up based on their eventual role in the story. An expert who helps the hero later in the story should be set up first. When heroes can pull experts out of the air, it makes the story look fake. It also looks bad when a character is set up in an obvious device to help the hero, like an explosive expert who suddenly shows up and lives and breathes his work and right away asks the hero when they can blow something up. You need to be able to have characters that are organically placed in the story. They can still be experts, but the term the best in their field is a cliche. It's also saying somebody belongs to an elite team. That's another cliche. I've heard that so many times, it's ridiculous. I'm sure you have too. It's better to demonstrate how good someone is rather than tell it. As I told you before, show don't tell. If I told you I was the greatest writer who ever lived, I'm sure you'd think I was a jerk or an egomaniac. It's highly unlikely that you'll agree with me. People have to prove how good they are, and you need to demonstrate that in the story as well so that we believe that. So there's usually a scene that's a setup to the payoff of the character, sort of like a subplot. And it's first it demonstrates that the character is good. A good example is James Bond movies. They always have this prequel scene that shows what a badass James Bond is, so that you know going in that he was somebody who can do something great if he has to. And also saying somebody is the best is what they do is usually weakens the conflict, because if you blow up the character too much, it weakens the opposition. So as we talked about in conflict and hero versus villain, if you make your hero more powerful than the villain, then it just seems like the hero is beating up on the villain, even if the villain is a bad guy. It's not really exciting. That's why I was never into those Steven Seagal movies, because he never got hurt. He's always beating up people without any effort, and nobody can stop him. That becomes very dull, and so that's something, again, you want to avoid. But the main thing is setups things discreetly and pay off grandly. That's the good formula to study. Setups and payoffs are very useful tools. And that's it for this episode. I will see you next time. And again, check out my links below. Please subscribe if you haven't done so. And please like this video if you can. I'd really appreciate it. It helps my channel. And I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much.